This is Damon Fordham with the Oral History Project with the Charleston Preservation Society, and I'm speaking on March the 12th, 2022 with Dr. Maxine Smith. How are you, Ms. Smith?
I'm doing good, thank you.
Very good. So please tell us, what is your full name and address?
Full name is Maxine Smith. My home address is 21 Devereaux Avenue, and that's Charleston, South Carolina, 29403. Mm-hmm. I was born August the 9th, 1944.
Mm-hmm. Okay, in Charleston?
In Charleston, born at McClellan Banks Hospital. I'm a twin.
Mm-hmm. Really?
I was told by my mother and father that because there were no incubators at that hospital, then my twin died. We were identical twins, low birth weight babies, but not premature. My mother was told that she was going to have twins, and so she was excited. But my twin, who was named Maxine, weighed 3.5 pounds. I weighed 3 pounds. And then the story again that I was told was one of the nurses went home, one of the black nurses went home, of course, got a hot water bottle, and that's how they were able to keep me alive.
Could you please provide us with a brief background about yourself?
Native Charlestonian, have lived and worked in Charleston for most of my life. Have spent many years in education, teaching initially at Burke High School, and then with advanced degrees then taught at the College of Charleston, Trident Tech, Charleston Southern. And the disciplines that I taught in were education, English, public relations, journalism, public speaking, time management. So those were the courses that I taught at the various institutions. And from an administrative standpoint, I also have worked in public relations positions and sort of community outreach positions at the College of Charleston and for the City of Charleston.
Okay, what led you to decide to become a teacher?
Well, back then, that was a profession that Black women went into. There weren't many choices for us. I had the opportunity to attend a boarding school in North Carolina after attending Burke High School for 9th and 10th grades. My parents knew about the boarding school in North Carolina called called Palmer Memorial Institute in Sedalia. And so that was the high school that I graduated from. And after that, after graduating from Palmer, my parents had looked into, my mother in particular, had looked into the college that I would attend. And again, back then, young adults didn't really make decisions as to where we wanted to go to school. We were told where we were going to go to school by our parents. And so my mom said, well, you're going to go to Hampton. We looked into it, we can afford it, and blah, blah, blah. So I went to Hampton. After graduating from Hampton, again, I was still interested in the journalism and went to American University in Washington for a year. Didn't like the cold weather, didn't like the atmosphere on the campus, and was the only African American in my course of studies, of course, at that time. So came back to Charleston, and in search of looking for work, I was told that I could teach English at Burke High School, and that was my first entry into teaching. But loved every minute of it. One of the most rewarding professions ever when the light bulb goes off, as you know, as a professor yourself.
Now, speaking of teaching, I know that Palmer Institute in North Carolina was one of those schools that was founded by one of these legendary Black teachers of the Mary McLeod Bethune type. I can't remember the lady's name.
Charlotte Hawkins Brown.
Yes, Charlotte Hawkins Brown. I read her autobiography. Were you there during her era?
No, she had passed on by the time I got there.
Okay, but I'm sure you've been familiar with the stories about her.
Oh, yes, the etiquette's book, and we learned lots of lessons about how to be proper ladies, and it was interesting. There was a different stairwell for the boys and girls. It was very segregated in terms of by gender. Okay, so I was able to meet students from other parts of the United States, and also got to meet some students from Africa.
Okay, very good, very good. All right, so moving on from there. Now, can you tell us a little bit about the family businesses that you represent for this oral history interview?
So I would be representing the businesses that my father owned primarily because there were several that he owned, but also representing my mother, Emily Smith, who owned a beauty shop that was located on Cumming Street between Spring and Cannon. So I'm representing both of them who were entrepreneurs.
Okay. So what market category would you place these two particular businesses?
Well, for my mom, of course, it was a beauty shop, so she catered to Black women who needed to have their hair done. Mm-hmm. And then for my dad, because he had several different businesses, I would say the first one was the cab company, founded in 1936, it's a safety cab company. Mm-hmm. And he found that there was a need for Blacks to be transported to their jobs. And in many instances, they could not get either afford to ride in a cab owned by a yellow cab company, because that wasn't necessarily his competition, but that was the cab company that was operational for whites. And I don't know that they refused Blacks to be transported different places. But because Blacks were working in jobs where they had to be on the job either early in the morning or late in the afternoon or evening, then my father found that that would be a way for him to introduce a service that we as Black people needed. So he was able to be mentored and received information from, interestingly enough, Keith Summey's father-in-law, Mr. Crosby, who was the owner of Yellow Cab Company, was the person who I think gave my father a template on what he needed to do to start a cab company. And in the documents that I have at home, a few, because my dad was not someone who saved every receipt or every paper from his transactions, but the day of his funeral in 1995 when he died, I found several documents that showed that he did have a business and a friendship with Mr. Crosby. There was a newsletter published by the Yellow Cab Company where Mr. Crosby wrote an editorial as a tribute to my father, saying what a really nice man he was and what a great business person he was and how much he admired him. And because, well, the day of the funeral, he had ordered that all the cabs, the yellow cabs, ride the entire day with their lights on as a tribute to my father. So I thought that was really interesting for that time period to have that kind of relationship between a white man and a Black man. There was also a copy of a card from Mr. Crosby to my mother and my family, and then also a donation had been made to the church by Mr. Crosby in memory of my father. So that shows that he did have personal relationships with the people that he interacted with regardless of race.
So can you tell us a little bit about Mr. Smith's background?
So my father was born in Charleston. I did not meet his parents, of course, or any of his family members, one first cousin, a couple of cousins, but not siblings or, you know what I mean, his parents and grandparents. I did not meet them. But I'm told that he went to elementary school at Simonton and completed the 7th grade, but that was the only education. But the earliest recollection of a business that he started was in 1936. Mm-hmm. So I'd have to kind of do some math to figure out how old he was when he started that business.
Okay, he was born, 1913?
He was born 1913.
Right, okay.
So, we'd have to figure out how old he was when he started the safety cab company.
Oh, 23, very young man.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you know what it was about, I understand that there was the need for a Black taxi company for mm-hmm. the fact that a lot of Black people couldn't afford cars and such at that time. But do you know what kind of things led him to give him the confidence to be an entrepreneur?
I have no idea. At all of my years observing him, he was just always busy. My mom would say, don't answer the telephone after 6 o'clock at night because it's for your dad. And invariably the calls would be for him. And it was because he had started all of these different businesses. Again, if you own, one of the other businesses that he started early on was a service station. And so he was one of the first Blacks. I understand there were others who had an Esso service station that he ran.
I remember Esso.
It wasn't Exxon then, but Esso service station. And interestingly enough, he was really smart enough to locate the cab company and the cab company and the service station in the same facility or the same building. You know, like the cab company operators were in a room or office on the side of the service station. I think that was extremely smart, because nowadays we don't even see a lot of businesses owned by blacks where there's more than one thing happening in that one location. Very often you'll see, even if you pass along, look at businesses on King Street, you'll see a building, but then you see several shingles that say attorney, not banker, but whatever. There are other businesses in that one building. And I think he was smart enough to think that, well, why shouldn't I have the two of the businesses that I'm operating in the same location? So of course I want to credit him for branding and doing all sorts of things, but I just think he was really very smart in knowing to do that. So if people were looking for him, all they had to do was go to the service station. If he wasn't there, he was at the cab company. And then of course the other businesses that he established, or the other business that he established, was liquor stores. And during what I would call his heyday, he had four locations. Two in the city, well, three in the city. One at the corner of Noonan and President, one at Line and President, which is not even a block over.
Right.
One on Spring Street, and then another one in North Charleston on Meeting Street Road. And so, it took me the longest for the light bulb to go off. I always talk about that when talking about education and how we impact children, but it took a while for me to figure out that he met so many different people in the liquor stores, because people needed to buy liquor. A policeman, a fireman, persons in mortuary, but there were also ministers and ladies, people having parties and weddings that needed to come and buy their liquor. He was also able to sell the mini bottles when they were popular and were what clubs and restaurants could have. And so he had customers, and in fact, that back then, the restaurants and hotels were owned by people from Charleston. Francis Marion Hotel was owned by somebody from Charleston. The Mills House was owned by somebody from Charleston. So they were his customers. So of course, when my mom was ready to entertain and have a really big bridge party, because she had one that was, the theme was something about traveling all over the world, since she had. And your costume, or you had to dress in the clothing from another country. I mean, she was different too. But anyway, it was interesting then, because he had a business relationship with the people who owned the Francis Marion Hotel in the Mills. Then when my mother wanted to have a huge bridge party, she had at the Mills House. First black to have a party at the Mills House. When I got married, the first marriage, the wedding reception was at the Francis Marion Hotel, because my father had a relationship with the owner of Francis Marion Hotel. So again, because of the relationships that he was able to build as a businessman, it opened doors for him, regardless of his color.
That you were also, because of this relationship, you all were allowed in places that were not always open to other African Americans. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I would say that we weren't accustomed to visiting those establishments for those kinds of occasions.
Okay.
And let's just say, because of my father's relationship with the owners of those establishments, he basically just said, well, my wife wants to have a bridge party, and she's inviting X number. It was a huge party, because I remember I had to go, and I was working for her that day, helping out. But it was huge. But again, I could tell from the way the individuals who worked at the hotel, those who were cleaning rooms or whatever, they were like, wow, who is this person? And she was able to have her bridge party there because of my father's relationship with the owner. Same thing with the wedding reception at the Francis Marion Hotel. Relationships. So I think a lot of what he was able to do was because he was in those businesses and his friendships with these individuals.
Now, while we're on the subject of that, I understand that perhaps the most powerful individual that he was involved with was our congressman at that time, Lucius Mendel Rivers. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I remember, and I believe I have a letter in the documents that I have, where Mendel Rivers, I believe, sent my father a thank you letter on his letterhead, thanking him for bringing the refreshments or something, I'm not sure how he worded it, to some meeting or an occasion in Columbia. And I just thought that was very interesting. Another relationship that I could say would show the kind of power that he had was because of my brother. My brother was Henry Albert Smith, and he died when he was 36 years old. He served a short time in the U.S. Army. And while serving in the U.S. Army, he went AWOL, I think that's what they called it.
Right, oh, absent without leave.
Okay. He had made it to become a military policeman, because I remember we do got pictures of him with the military police badge on his sleeve. I don't know which arm, but anyway. And I remember my parents getting a phone call saying that he had gone absent without leave. Well, normally in a situation like that, a young man would get a dishonorable discharge. Well, because my father knew Mendel Rivers and Strom Thurmond, he received a letter of discharge. Not dishonorable. So I think I do have that letter, which again shows you, we know that this happens in their world. We know that that's what happens in their world.
Right.
But again, to go way back then, to have something like that happen, I don't know of many men who would probably have a similar story. But it was because my father knew Strom Thurmond and Mendel Rivers, and there were lots of guys in the book, in fact, that I wrote about my dad, who said they couldn't get a job in the post office until my father introduced them to Mendel Rivers. There was one summer when Mendel was going to be in, Mr. Rivers rather, was going to be in Charleston and needed a chauffeur to drive him around to his different appointments. And he said, well, Henry, I'm going to need someone to drive me, to take me to different locations. And, I have a car, but I would need a driver. So my father asked Leroy Palmer, who's in the book, if he would be that person. And he says, oh no, I don't want to, you find something for me to do, but I don't want to do that, blah, blah, blah. My dad said, you will pick him up and take him wherever he needs to go. So he did, because he was young, and my father was a mentor to him. So of course he said, okay, Mr. Smith, I'll do it, or Henry, or whatever he called him. Well, as he complains to Mendel Rivers about not being able to get a job in the post office, guess what happened?
What?
Every summer after that, he was able to work at the post office at East Bay Street because of that relationship and what happened. And I did not realize that Bobby Palmer worked for Homeland Security until he sent his memories about my dad for the book.
Right.
I knew that he lived in DC. He got married and lived there for years, but I never knew what he did. And because his personality was such, I won't say that he was a troublemaker, but he was just someone that was always having a good time and was always fun to be around. I never in a million years would have, I think of someone working in Homeland Security as being reserved and, not getting into any kind of mix-ups, but that was his occupational field. But again, another gentleman who's in the book, his name is Albert Middleton, I believe, tried to get a transfer from the DC post office to Charleston and couldn't until he went to my father, and my dad talked to Mendel, and the next thing he got transferred here to Charleston. So it's those relationships, I think, that would just happened.
Which is ironic when you consider that these individuals like Senator Thurmond and Congressman Rivers, were known for their hostility to the civil rights movement and such. So that's an interesting, that adds a lot of complexity as to how that situation worked in those days.
So I don't know if they thought of him as just a good old boy, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Or if they elevated that from he was a man that they admired and treated, you know, like they would treat anyone else. I would want to think that that was why those relationships happened. The safety car company that was started in 1936, my first cousin Emily Smith, who's passed on as well. You interviewed her.
Yes, years ago.
So she ran the cab company office and trained the other operators. And I mean, she knew the city and the map and the directions to get the drivers like, you know, it was like nothing. You know, no notes, no, I mean, once she learned the map and the streets, she was amazing at that. So she worked for many years for my dad. So yes, there was a relative, Emily Smith, a cousin, who was a major operator, or the main operator at the cab company. And she was with him for many years. She also wrote her memories of him in the book. And my brother, I think at one time, drove one of the cabs, but you know, that didn't last a long time because he was interested in partying, having a good time.
Now, while on that subject, so were there a lot of outside investors in the business?
No.
Okay. So now I understand you also promoted a lot of entertainment and stage shows for Black people in this area. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, from what I understand, there were individuals in cities with similar populations as Charleston, I guess. And as the entertainers traveled from one state to the next, they would just call their connections.
Chitlin Circuit.
And so then my father was on that list, I guess, and then he would get a call saying, well, James Brown was in Columbia, did we want to have him in Charleston? And he would say, yes, of course. Well, for that research, I went to have it included in the book. I went to the library, I forget what they call the history room, but you can go.
South Carolina room.
Yeah, the South Carolina room. You can research advertisements. Mm-hmm. So I went to the archives with the Post-Inquiria and basically just said concerts on Henry Smith. And again, for branding, he called his shows, the shows were just called Henry Smith Presents. And then it was the name of the artist, whoever it was. And I mean, there were a wide array of them. And stage shows, I mean, Count Basie and his band, and normally it would be Count Basie and his band, but also other artists on the same show. James Brown, of course, with his orchestra. Trying to think of some of the other artists who
Louis Jordan?
Lionel Hampton, Louis Jordan, Etta James, and I was amazed at what the ticket prices were. I mean, they were really very cheap because that was a long time ago. But when I look back at them in the last couple of years, it was surprising. There was also a little write-up on each of the ads that said, whites welcome or white spectators welcome. I would work the concession stand. And of course, I would be very popular then in school because everybody wanted to get in free to these shows. Otherwise, you know, I was being bullied and chased home because I was Henry Smith's daughter. But for the concerts though, I had lots of friends then. But the whites would come, and interestingly enough, well, I believe the blacks were downstairs because of course they wanted to dance, and the whites were seated in the balcony, which was the opposite for us, because of course when we went to the movie theaters and what have you, as blacks we would have to sit in the balcony. But they sat in the balcony. But of course, once the music started, they would come downstairs because they wanted to dance too. So it was really interesting to see that dynamic. Nothing ever happened. There were never any fights, never anything, you know, that happened negatively. And so that's what it was. I got to meet Lionel Hampton, and I got to meet James Brown. My father brought them to the house. And I remember my mom being very embarrassed because when Lionel Hampton came to the house, and it was a two-story house on Noonan Street, I went to the top of the stairs and I said, "Oh, hi, did you bring me something?" And my mom cringed, which kids usually will say what you don't want them to say.
Right.
And that was one of those moments. But, I got in trouble for being that precocious.
So now, can you tell us a little bit about the multiple locations of these businesses?
Okay, so I told you about the liquor store location. So, Noonan and President and Line Street between St. Philip and King, and then Meeting Street Road near Bertha's Kitchen.
Okay.
For the cab stand, or for the cab company, I remember it being the first location that I remember was the corner of Ashley and Fishburne. There was a doctor's office there not too long ago, but I think it's just, the building is still there now. People are using it to park, but I don't think that there's any active business being located there now. That was the Esso service station. He was one of the first to have a Shell oil service station, and that one was located at Cannon and Cumming, and that was there for a long time.
I remember that.
Yeah, but of course, on the side was cab company. The Shell oil service station was on the corner of Cannon and Cumming, and was probably, from what I remember, the largest service station operation that he owned. But then on the side of it was a cab company, and so the cabs came in, and the operators, had different shifts that they worked, and they would come into that same location. I remember that my dad and the men who worked in the service station wore these uniforms, khaki shirts and pants, and had a little Shell emblem on their shirts. They looked very neat. But I can remember, if I was ever in the vicinity of the service station, people were coming in looking for my dad all times of day and all times of night. And if he wasn't there, they would come back. And they'd just make several trips because they had a problem on issue. That was just his personality. He was a helper, and he was someone that people went to when they didn't know what to do or where to go. I laugh because sometimes I remember or hearing my mother talk about him being called if there was a couple having an argument or a dispute, I'll call it that. And he would go to be the referee or whatever. And then there would be times when teenagers would be lost. The parents wouldn't know where they were. And I think that I never thought about it this way until some time ago, but I think that he might have even talked to the cab drivers to say, if you're out there downtown or driving around a certain area, if you see so-and-so, then let me know because the dad's looking for him or the dad's looking for her. So that's kind of funny when you think about it, but he was everywhere. And then I understood after a while why he took a nap during the day sometimes, because he was out all hours of the night,
Thus the midnight mayor.
Yeah, thus the midnight mayor, finding people, or breaking up arguments between husbands and wives, or helping troubled kids get back home to their parents. So he was just wanted to be busy.
Well, that's good to know.
And helpful, I would add that.
Oh, obviously so. So can you describe was the culture around the business different than that of the culture of the surrounding residential community?
Well, I would definitely say it was different because, of course, things were segregated. Mm-hmm. We lived on Noonan Street, which was all black, and now Noonan Street is pretty much mostly white. My parents were able to buy a home in Devereux, where I am now, back in the late 60s. In fact, I was probably still at Hampton when they bought that house. And that was a street mostly populated by Jewish families. So when I came home from college, that was where I went, to the home on Devereux Avenue. And of course, as the Jewish families moved, and I think they were moving West Ashley to South Windermere and other points. So as they moved West Ashley, then of course there were some blacks who were able to move in and buy those properties. Now it's like, I won't say this, but I get business cards in my door. I get letters, 2-page letters giving, this is where I live, I'd like to buy your home. I don't want to tear it down. I want my kids to be able to kayak and fish, to be on the water, and I mean, it's very interesting. But there are not many of us that are left on that street now.
Okay. So the businesses, do they cater to a specific clientele within the African American community, or just overall, the general?
I think overall, because of location, and there is a person in the book, Renee Gators, who talks about that. When she moved to Charleston, met my father, he said, wherever you move your law office, it should be on a main thoroughfare. And so her office is on Cannon Street. And she gets offers all the time now. She says she doesn't have to worry about her retirement because people are off wanting to buy her building because of its location. I don't know if he was that smart to know about where to locate the cab company and the service station because he was, knew the outline of the city, or if he just knew that it was a thoroughfare, so why not put a service station there? If somebody needs gas, they're gonna stop. If they're passing through, if they're traveling in the city, that's a location that you know the location now. It's mostly condominiums there in that location now. But as I recall, as a girl and as a young woman growing up, it was a great location for a service station. So I think if you were traveling, regardless of your race, you stopped at the Shell, and that was a prominently known gas company. You stopped there for gas. And it just, it was a service station then. I don't know where in America there's a service station where a woman can go in to buy gas and somebody comes and cleans the windshields for her, the windows for her. But that was the kind of service that they gave, and people loved it. But they would clean the windows, just help if you needed help. We'll come out, use the restrooms. You got trash in the car that you need to empty, whatever. But it was a service station. So I think because they provided a service, that was another reason why they had repeat customers. But I never saw my father with a notebook. Every now and then he might have some little slips of paper that he kept in a pocket. He had a cigar box that he kept in the liquor store on Spring Street. And I believe he kept, if somebody had to cash a check and the check wasn't a good check, he held it for them until it was good and then cashed it. Or he would let somebody borrow money from him. He would put the slips of paper in that box. But I just did not know him to have the kind of paperwork or documents around him that I would think a business person would have, we're computer savvy now, so we do everything. My accountant loves me because I do everything in Excel. When I go to her, I have all these spreadsheets, and she said, oh yeah, I can do I've done my return for 2021. I've gotten my refunds already. Just because I'm that way, when it's time to meet with her. She's in Mounts Corner. I try to do business with African Americans, and she is someone who is African American. That's something that I think my father did too, or that they did. It could be because they were limited with some.
Yeah, they didn't have much choice.
They didn't have much choice. But I try to encourage African Americans to do that because there's so few of us. For printing, I have a printer that I go to. For certain restaurants, I try not to always go to a white restaurant. But again, my accountant is African American. She's in Mounts Corner. There may be a time when I won't be able to travel, but I bet she'll come to me, especially if I'm still giving her everything in an Excel spreadsheet.
What has become of these businesses since the passing of Mr. Smith? Did the destruction of a lot of Ashley Avenue and the Crosstown and all that have any effect on it, or any of these other things?
I would say that the business that did continue after he passed was the cab company. And so
that's right.
In 1995, of course, he died. He started in 1936. Believe it or not, that company is still in existence.
Right.
So I sold the company in 1998, I believe, to James Ford.
My cousin, yes.
Your cousin. And then he kept the business until just last year, and has sold it to a couple. I've met them on the phone. I haven't met them in person yet. But I just think that now is a great time for a Black-owned cab company because many of the blacks who need, again, still don't have cars, still need transportation to get to work and what have you, cannot afford Lyft and Uber prices.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think now's the time to really build that company. And I really regret that I haven't had a chance to sit with them and meet with them, because I do want to try to help them just share some ideas that I have about them expanding the business, because this is an opportune time for them to get new drivers, you know what I mean? Maybe change the color of the cabs. Because we don't have the Chronicle anymore, there's not been a way for them to be introduced to the black community. So, you know, that's something that I need to do to keep that company going on. But that's really the only business that has continued that he started.
Okay, so what led to your decision to preserve the story in a book?
Because I have so many stories to tell about him. I just continue to meet people who, you know, say they were impacted by him in some way. When I started working on my doctorate and traveling to South Carolina State, I met a student who said that there were times when he was in undergraduate school at South Carolina State, his mother or father could not afford to pay whatever the next tuition payment was. But then he would, you know, they would call my father, or he would call my father and borrow the money to pay his next tuition payment. So I just think that because I keep meeting people who knew him and had just wonderful things to say about him, I said, okay, it's time to do the book.
You have enough time to talk a little bit about your mother. Can you tell us about her background?
Okay, so my mom's background is a little different in that she did attend more than just elementary school. She and her siblings were able to attend the Avery Institute on Bull Street. And then she was able to attend, back during their time, because they had diplomas from Avery, they could teach in the elementary schools in the rural counties.
The normal schools.
Yeah, the normal schools. But I guess my mom wanted more than that, and so she decided to go to beauty culture school in New York, and so she went to the Apex Beauty School, and I have documentation from those years. Then she opened her own beauty shop on Cumming Street between Cannon and Spring. And it was a little tiny shop. I remember, you know, stopping in there lots of times to see her, but it was enough space for her and several other operators that she trained. But again, she was a beautician along the same time with Ethel R. Brown and Elizabeth Funderburk, whose shop was over there near Ebenezer on Nassau Street. But again, they had a great sisterhood, so to speak, and connected with beauticians and traveled all over the world. So they were quite prosperous in that they saved their money and traveled. They utilized a black travel agency out of Atlanta to plan all of their trips.
Like with the Green Book.
And I think it was the Henderson Travel Agency, if my memory serves me correct. But I probably have that documentation in my mother's archives.
Okay, what was her name again?
I believe it was the Henderson Travel Agency.
No, your mother's name.
Oh, Emily Smith.
So how long did that business last?
I don't have dates in mind for how long her businesses ran. I'd have to really look that up. But I do know that she worked for a number of years. And then of course, because other women were trained in the business, then she pretty much just traveled and had her bridge parties. And other operators were, once they were licensed, then they ran the business, and she was more of a socialite. And I have pictures of her with attending different bridge parties. That was something that they did. In her obituary, I remember researching and finding that she belonged to at least 4 bridge clubs. And so that was prominent for women during that time. In fact, Timothy Askew, who's in the book, his wife was saying that she used to go to my mom to get her hair done. So I told her, well, when I put the book together for my mom, you know, I'll have to get you to consult with me on what you remember. But she said that the beauticians were women that she and some of her friends looked up to because they were business owners. You know, those who were had beauty shops, or those who had their alterations businesses and other kinds of entrepreneurial opportunities. I can remember though, on Spring Street, like I said, one of my father's liquor stores was on Spring. The building was owned by Seabrook Hill.
Mhm.
His wife was Louise Hill, who used to run the post office on Ashley Avenue years ago. Ashley between Spring and Bogart. Little tiny post office right across the street from the Woods household.
Was that torn down during the,
It's still there, I think. I think there's like a corner, not a restaurant, but you know how they have these little places where you get breakfast and
right, in cafes and
yeah,
stuff?
little cafe. I think that took part of that where that post office used to be.
Okay.
But you know Andre Woods on Ashley.
Yes.
Okay, so his mom was the postmaster in there.
Oh, really?
And Louise Hill was a postmaster in that post office. But her husband owned 44 Spring. That was where one of my dad's liquor stores was. And I mentioned that to say that on Spring, I remember there were so many black-owned businesses. But on Spring, I can remember there being a bakery.
Yes.
There was barbershops. There was a hat shop owned by Jewel Miller.
Yes.
Jewel Miller. Was that last name Miller? I think.
Right.
Jewel Michael. Because her husband was one of the first black police officers, Mr. Michael. But anyway, she had a millinery store on Spring before you get to President, I think it was way down. The Tobias Gadsden family had
Yes,
the barbershop.
Yes, I went there.
On Spring. So I mean, yeah, it was quite impressive, I think, to have so many businesses on that one street. So I think in the Spring Street, Cumming Street, President Street, all in the inner city, as we used to call it, were many black businesses. I would imagine that it stayed open until, I know it wasn't open until when she died, but there was no one that took the business over when she left the business.
Got it.
So, yeah, but there were other beauticians that had established, throughout the city and in other places. You probably know Katie Catalan.
I've heard the name.
Okay, so she is a younger woman who then established a beauty shop and had a couple of locations. So I would say that was definitely a way that black women made a good bit of money. And even today, you hear about the young women who get braids and have special, hairstyles that they wear. And they talk about the cost as though it's, well, this is what I pay. And I mean, they're willing to pay the price. So I think that's wonderful that we're still able to use our hands and talents.